Emily Harris stood before the full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, adjusting the delicate lace veil that cascaded down her back like a waterfall of ivory dreams, and memories of how she got to this moment flooded through her mind with the force of 1,000 emotions all at once. She remembered the first time she saw James Mitchell at that charity gala 3 years ago, where she was coordinating the event and he was a guest speaker discussing accessibility in urban design, and his words had captivated everyone in the room, but it was his smile that had captured her heart completely. James had been confident, articulate, and undeniably magnetic as he spoke about his work as an architect, and when their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, Emily felt something shift inside her chest, like the tumblers of a lock finally clicking into place after years of searching. The accident happened 6 months before they met, and James had been honest about it from their very first conversation over coffee the following week, when Emily had worked up the courage to call the number on his business card with trembling fingers. A drunk driver had run a red light and changed everything in an instant, leaving James with a spinal injury the doctors said would keep him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, but he refused to let that define who he was or what he could accomplish. Their relationship blossomed slowly at first, with coffee dates turning into long dinners and weekend adventures through the city where they discovered hidden bookstores, art galleries, and restaurants that became their special places, filled with laughter and connection. Emily fell in love with James, not despite his disability, but because of the incredible person he was inside, someone who faced each day with courage, determination, and an infectious optimism that made her want to be a better version of herself. Her friends and family had been supportive, though she caught the worried glances and hushed conversations when they thought she wasn't listening, as if loving James was somehow a sacrifice she was making, rather than the greatest gift she had ever received. But Emily knew the truth, and the truth was that James made her happier than she had ever been in her entire life, and his wheelchair was just a part of their story, not the defining chapter of it. As an event planner, Emily had organized hundreds of weddings for other couples, but planning her own felt different, more meaningful, and she wanted every detail to reflect the unique love she shared with James. The venue was a restored historic mansion with ramps and accessible features that James had helped design, ensuring that all their guests, regardless of ability, could celebrate with them in comfort and joy. Her dress was a stunning creation of silk and lace that she had found after months of searching, something that made her feel like the most beautiful version of herself while still being practical enough to kneel beside James during certain parts of the ceremony. Now, standing in her bedroom with her mother fastening the final buttons down her back, Emily felt a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and pure, overwhelming joy that made her eyes well up with tears she refused to let fall and ruin her makeup. Her sister Claire burst through the door holding a bouquet of white roses and lavender, the exact flowers Emily had requested because they reminded her of the garden where James had proposed on a perfect spring evening 6 months ago. The proposal had been simple and perfect, with James taking her hand in his and telling her that he was her everything, his partner, his best friend, and the love of his life, before producing a ring that sparkled in the fading sunlight. Emily had said yes before he even finished asking, and they had stayed in that garden until the stars came out, talking about their future together and all the adventures they would share as husband and wife. Now, that future was just hours away, and Emily could hardly believe that this day had finally arrived after months of planning, preparation, and anticipation that felt like both an eternity and the blink of an eye. Her phone buzzed with a text from James saying he couldn't wait to see her at the altar and that he loved her more than words could express, which made her smile so wide her cheeks hurt. Emily tucked her phone away and took one last look in the mirror, seeing not just a bride, but a woman who had found her soulmate and was about to embark on the greatest adventure of her life. The ceremony space was breathtaking, with hundreds of candles flickering along the aisle and white roses intertwined with ivy hanging from every surface, creating an atmosphere that felt both magical and intimate at the same time.
Emily waited behind the grand wooden doors, clutching her father's arm as the string quartet began playing the opening notes of the processional, and her heart hammered against her ribcage with such force she thought everyone must surely hear it. Through the crack in the door, she could see James waiting at the altar, seated in his wheelchair, looking impossibly handsome in his tailored navy suit, with his best man David standing beside him, offering quiet words of encouragement. The doors opened, and suddenly all eyes turned toward her, but Emily only saw James, and the way his face transformed when he caught sight of her walking down that long aisle was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Tears streamed down his cheeks unabashedly, and Emily felt her own eyes burning with emotion as she moved closer to the man who had changed everything she thought she knew about love, strength, and what it meant to truly commit to another person. Her father placed her hand in James and whispered something about taking care of his little girl before stepping back to join her tearful mother in the front row. And Emily squeezed James' hand, feeling the familiar warmth and strength that always made her feel safe. The officiant began speaking about love, partnership, and the journey that Emily and James had traveled together through challenges and triumphs that had only strengthened their bond and deepened their commitment to one another. James spoke his vows first, and his voice was steady despite the emotion evident in every word as he promised to love her, honor her, and stand by her side through whatever life brought their way, for better or for worse. Emily repeated her own vows, feeling as though her heart might burst from the sheer magnitude of the love she felt for this incredible man who had taught her that true strength comes not from physical ability, but from the courage to be vulnerable and authentic. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife and invited James to kiss his bride, and as he pulled Emily down toward him, their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey through uncertainty and doubt. The guests erupted in applause, and Emily pulled back slightly to look into James' eyes, seeing reflected there all the love, hope, and promise that their future together held, and she felt herself smiling so hard her face ached. But then something unexpected happened, and James released her hands, placing his palms firmly on the armrests of his wheelchair, and before Emily could process what was happening, he began to push himself upward. Time seemed to slow down as James rose from the wheelchair, his legs straightening beneath him, supporting his full weight for the first time since Emily had known him, and the room fell into a stunned silence. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears blurred her vision, and she watched in complete disbelief as James stood before her, tall and steady with a smile that was both triumphant and tender spreading across his face. He reached for her and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist and lifting her slightly off the ground in an embrace that felt surreal and perfect and impossible all at once as the crowd behind them erupted into chaos. Questions flooded Emily's mind faster than she could process them, and she clung to James as if he might disappear if she let go, while her brain struggled to make sense of what her eyes were clearly seeing but couldn't quite believe. James whispered in her ear that he loved her and that he had something to explain, but first he wanted to hold his wife properly for the first time as a married couple, and Emily nodded, unable to form words through her shock and joy.
The reception hall buzzed with excited chatter as guests tried to make sense of the miraculous moment they had just witnessed at the altar, and Emily sat beside James at the head table, still in a state of shocked disbelief that threatened to overwhelm her completely. James held her hand tightly as if anchoring her to reality, while friends and family approached with questions, congratulations, and expressions of utter amazement that ranged from tears of joy to demands for explanation and everything in between. Finally, when the initial chaos had settled slightly, James stood again, drawing every eye in the room and tapped his glass, requesting everyone's attention for an explanation that Emily desperately needed to hear as much as anyone else present.
He began by explaining that 8 months ago, his doctors had approached him about an experimental surgery combined with intensive physical therapy that offered a possibility, not a guarantee, of regaining some mobility in his legs over time. The procedure was risky, expensive, and had no promise of success, which was why James had initially dismissed it as false hope that could lead to devastating disappointment if things didn't work out the way everyone desperately wanted them to. But his medical team had been persistent, and after much consideration, James had decided to try, believing that even a small improvement in his condition would be worth the risk, pain, and grueling rehabilitation process that would follow. What he hadn't anticipated was how well his body would respond to the treatment, and over the following months, through countless hours of therapy, exercises, and sheer determination, James had slowly begun to regain strength and mobility. He had kept it secret from Emily, making excuses for extended business trips and meetings when he was actually at the rehabilitation center, working with therapists who pushed him further than he thought possible every single day. The decision to hide this from her had been the hardest choice of his life, but James explained that he needed to know with absolute certainty that Emily was marrying him for who he was, not out of hope for who he might become. He had wanted their love to remain pure, untainted by expectations or obligations that might come from knowing about his progress. And he needed Emily to say yes to the man in the wheelchair, not to some future possibility. There had been moments when he almost told her, when the secret felt too heavy to carry alone, but his therapists and doctors had encouraged him to wait until he was certain the progress would last and not regress unexpectedly. The plan had always been to stand at their wedding as a symbol of new beginnings and to show Emily that their love had given him strength he didn't know he possessed and motivation to push beyond every limit the doctors had set. Emily listened with tears streaming down her face as conflicting emotions warred within her chest, and she felt simultaneously overjoyed, angry, confused, grateful, and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what James had kept from her. Part of her understood his reasoning and appreciated the romantic gesture of wanting their love to be pure, untainted by external factors that might have influenced her decision to marry him or changed their dynamic. But another part felt hurt that he hadn't trusted her enough to share this journey with her, to let her be part of the struggle and triumph instead of experiencing it as a spectator at their own wedding. James turned to her then, and his eyes were filled with love, remorse, and hope, as he explained that keeping this secret had been torture, but he had genuinely believed it was the right thing to do for both of them. He apologized for any pain his deception had caused and promised that from this moment forward there would be no more secrets between them, only honesty, trust, and the partnership they had always promised each other. Emily stood and faced her husband, feeling the weight of this revelation settling over her like a heavy blanket, and she knew that what she said next would set the tone for their entire marriage going forward. She took a deep breath and looked into James's eyes, seeing the man she loved, the man she had chosen, and the man who had just shown her that even in love there could be complications that tested the very foundations of trust. Emily reached up and cupped James's face in her hands, feeling the slight stubble on his jaw and the warmth of his skin as she searched his eyes for the truth behind his intentions, and found only love, vulnerability, and hope reflected back at her. She spoke softly at first, telling him that while she understood his reasoning, the secret had created a barrier between them that felt like a betrayal of the partnership they had promised to build together, based on complete honesty and transparency. The room remained silent as every guest leaned forward, straining to hear the private conversation happening between the newlyweds, and Emily realized that this moment would define not just their wedding day, but the entire trajectory of their marriage. She told James that she had fallen in love with him exactly as he was, in his wheelchair, with all the challenges and adaptations that came with it, and his ability to walk didn't change the depth of her feelings or her commitment. But she also admitted that discovering this truth in such a public, dramatic way felt overwhelming, and she needed time to process the emotions swirling through her mind like a tornado of joy, confusion, hurt, and gratitude, all mixed together. James nodded, understanding evident in his expression, and he pulled her close, whispering apologies against her hair while promising that he would spend the rest of their lives making up for this one mistake in judgment. Emily pulled back and managed a small smile, telling him that she loved him whether he was sitting or standing, and that nothing could change the vows they had just exchanged or the commitment they had made before God and everyone they cared about. She announced to their guests that while this revelation was unexpected and overwhelming, it was also a beautiful testament to James's strength, determination, and the power of love to inspire people to achieve what seemed impossible. The room erupted in applause, and Emily felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as friends and family surrounded them with hugs, congratulations, and tears of joy that washed away some of the complicated emotions clouding the celebration. David, the best man, raised his glass and proposed a toast to the happy couple, praising their love, resilience, and ability to surprise everyone with a wedding day twist that would be talked about for years to come. As the reception continued, Emily found herself watching James move through the crowd, standing tall and steady as he greeted guests, accepted congratulations, and even shared a dance with his tearful mother, who kept touching his face in disbelief. Emily danced with her father, who whispered that James must love her very much to have worked so hard and kept such a difficult secret, and that while the method was questionable, the intention came from a place of pure devotion. When the first dance was announced, Emily felt her heart racing again as James took her hand and led her to the center of the floor, where they had planned for him to remain seated while she danced around him. Instead, James pulled her into his arms properly, and they swayed together to their song, while Emily rested her head against his chest, hearing his heartbeat and feeling the solid strength of his body supporting them both. She whispered that she wished she could have been there for him during the therapy sessions, the painful days, and the small victories, and James promised that from now on they would face everything together, no matter how difficult or uncertain. As the night wore on, Emily began to feel the weight of exhaustion mixed with emotional overload, and she found herself craving quiet time alone with her new husband to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. James seemed to sense her need and suggested they slip away from the reception early, leaving their guests to continue celebrating while they retreated to the honeymoon suite upstairs for privacy and honest conversation. Emily agreed, and they made their way through the crowd, accepting final congratulations and well wishes, before escaping up the grand staircase to a room filled with candles, rose petals, and champagne waiting on ice. Once alone, Emily kicked off her heels and sank onto the plush sofa, feeling the full impact of the day finally catching up with her, as tears began flowing freely for the first time since James had stood at the altar. James sat beside her and pulled her close, letting her cry without trying to fix anything or offer explanations, and just holding her while she released all the pent-up emotions she had been containing for the sake of their guests.
After the tears subsided, Emily looked up at James with red, puffy eyes and told him they needed to talk, really talk, about what this revelation meant for their marriage, trust, and the future they were building together, starting right now. James nodded and began sharing details about the surgery, the months of painful rehabilitation, the setbacks and small victories, and the countless times he had wanted to call Emily, but stopped himself, believing his plan was best. He described waking up at dawn for therapy sessions that left him exhausted and frustrated, working with doctors who pushed him beyond his comfort zone, and spending nights alone, wondering if he was making a terrible mistake keeping this secret. Emily listened without interrupting, and she began to understand the magnitude of what James had endured alone while simultaneously planning their wedding, maintaining his architectural practice, and pretending everything was normal when they spoke each day. She admitted that while his intentions came from love, the execution had robbed her of the chance to support him through one of the most significant challenges of his life, and that hurt more than she initially realized. James apologized again, more deeply this time, and acknowledged that his desire to prove something about their love had been selfish in ways he hadn't fully considered until seeing the pain in her eyes after the ceremony. Emily took his hands and told them that moving forward, their marriage would require complete honesty, even when the truth was difficult, uncomfortable, or potentially disappointing, because partnership meant sharing burdens, not carrying them alone in misguided attempts at protection. She explained that she didn't need him to be perfect or to shield her from hard things, but rather to trust her strength, resilience, and commitment enough to let her walk beside him through whatever life brought their way. James promised with tears in his eyes that he would never keep another secret of this magnitude, and that he understood now that true love meant vulnerability, transparency, and the courage to be imperfect together rather than perfect alone. They talked for hours about expectations, boundaries, and how they would handle challenges going forward, establishing ground rules for communication that would serve as the foundation for a marriage built on genuine partnership and mutual respect. Emily shared her own fears about being enough for James now that his physical limitations had changed, and whether the dynamic of their relationship would shift in ways that might diminish the unique connection they had built. James assured her that nothing fundamental had changed between them, and that his love for her was rooted in who she was as a person, not in what she could do for him or how she accommodated his needs. They discussed practical matters too, like how this change would affect their daily lives, their home modifications, and the identity James had built around being a disabled architect who advocated for accessibility in design and urban planning. James admitted that he felt strange about the transformation and worried about losing connection with the disability community that had embraced him and given his work purpose, meaning, and a perspective he valued deeply, regardless of his personal circumstances. Emily suggested that his unique experience of living both with and without disability would make him an even more powerful advocate, and that his story could inspire others facing similar challenges not to give up hope when progress seemed impossible. As dawn began to break through the windows, Emily realized they had talked through the entire night, but instead of feeling exhausted, she felt clearer, more connected to James than ever before, despite the rocky start to their marriage. She told him that while she wished things had unfolded differently, she could see now that this experience had forced them to confront important questions about trust, honesty, and partnership before those issues could fester and cause bigger problems later. James agreed and said that in some strange way, the discomfort of this conversation was exactly what they needed to establish the kind of marriage where both people felt safe being vulnerable, honest, and imperfect without fear of judgment or rejection. They decided together that they would face whatever came next as true partners, sharing victories and struggles equally, and building a life based on the hard-won understanding that love requires constant effort, communication, and willingness to grow together. Emily looked at her husband in the soft morning light and felt a surge of hope for their future, knowing that they had already survived their first real test as a married couple and emerged stronger, more honest, and more committed than before. James stood and extended his hand to Emily, pulling her up and into his arms, where they stood together at the window, watching the sun rise over the city and feeling the promise of new beginnings washing over them like golden light. Emily whispered that she loved him with everything she had and that she was ready to start this adventure together with all its unexpected twists, challenges, and beautiful surprises that would make their story uniquely and perfectly theirs. James kissed her softly and replied that marrying her was the best decision he had ever made and that he would spend every day of their lives proving that her trust, faith, and love were not misplaced, but cherished, protected, and returned tenfold. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Emily realized that the wedding day twist had given them something unexpected. Not just the miracle of James walking, but a deeper understanding of what their marriage would require to truly thrive. They had learned that love wasn't just about romantic gestures and beautiful moments, but about hard conversations, honest reflections, and the daily choice to show up for each other with authenticity, courage, and unwavering commitment no matter what surprises life brought.
She smiled at James and suggested they finally get some rest before embarking on their honeymoon. And he agreed, leading her toward the bedroom where they could sleep peacefully, knowing they had survived the storm and emerged on the other side together, stronger than ever before.